this room than I do. Marty is an expert, I believe, as most everybody knows, on just about everything relating to medical clinics. And we're very fortunate to have him this morning. And he's going to talk about succession planning. And anything else that you'd like to share?
Okay, if you could get the slide here.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it's in there. Let me go get it.
I know it's on there.
Yeah.
So this morning, we're going to be, as frequently are very nimble. And the reason being is, I thought this was an hour and a half of me. So I've got an hour and a half of stuff that we're going to hear in about 15 minutes. And you're not to look at your card where it says successful planning, because we're going to be successful in planning, regardless. But what we are going to talk about today is succession planning, which is something altogether different, but equally important to all of you. Maybe I can start off by asking, because your association is fortunate in having a number of executive directors who have been in their positions for more than a day. If you could just stand for a moment, how many of you have been in your position at least 5 years? Okay, stay standing. Those of you that have been in more than 10 years, if you haven't been, sit down.
There we go.
And we're not going to embarrass people and ask them exactly how long they've been in there. But what we are going to say about this is that you do have a number of clinic directors who have been in their positions for 5, 10, 15 years. And that's great for the clinic, usually. What that means is you have continuity of leadership, you've got continuity of successful planning that has gone on over years and built upon a history. But succession planning talks about what happens when someone in an essential position in your organization leaves. And the one thing that I will guarantee you is that every one of those people that stood up will at some point leave their position. And for an organization, if you are to remain strong and viable and have that event occur with as little disruption as possible, it requires a planful approach to that fact. All of us need to be thinking about what comes next, both in terms of our programs, our clinic, but as well as our leadership. This can happen quickly. It can happen planfully. People get hit by buses all the time. Sometimes clinic directors even get hit by buses. And all of a sudden you have a leadership. Here's the definition of succession planning that I'd like to share with you. It's a thoughtful process that involves a smooth transition for clinic leadership, not only of the executive director, but we're going to pay some attention to the medical director. We're also going to pay some attention to your board during this presentation. And let me just interrupt myself to say, all of these slides that we're going to be delivered in 90 minutes will be made available to you through David, I think, on your website.
Correct.
You'll get this information after. Many organizations consider this one of their organizational values. So that looking ahead, which we heard yesterday, is one of the key functions of any board, is something that's valued throughout the organization. And there are responsibilities that are spread throughout the organization. The board has a particular responsibility in that they hire and evaluate, and in some cases decide that the executive director that they've hired and evaluated doesn't quite meet what they need, and so they're in charge of making sure that the right person is in that position. Part of what they can do to assist in succession planning is make sure that that individual has a good job description, a good set of goals that they're working towards annually, and that job description and those goals are not something that are just cast in stone, but that's actually something that the board thinks through on an annual basis, because things do change. I would suggest that the 5 or 6 people who were still standing when we said how many of you had been in ED 10 years or more could look back at their job description when they started and look at it now, and it would be totally different. Totally different. Not even close. But in addition to keeping it up to date, it also should be as specific as you can make it. I note the term here, we want a strong leader. Well, that can mean a lot of different things. And it's those kind of general terms that are hard to determine if you're doing an evaluation of someone, if indeed you have a strong leader. You have to be specific. You have to break that down. You have to be very clear on what that means. The board also has the responsibility to create an organizational structure within your clinic that allows for leadership development to occur. Now, I always get asked, my clinic's got 2 people in it. How are we going to do that? Well, you might have 2 staff. You might only even have 1 staff. But you've got volunteers. And in that, you build structure. You don't necessarily get a person in a position, train them for that position, and then anticipate that they're going to stay in that position forever. You want to have a structure within your organization, both staff and volunteers, that allow for upward mobility. It keeps people interested. It helps inspire growth. It's likely what allowed the number of leaders that you've got in the room to stay in the positions for as long as they have. I note this under a board responsibility because on the staff side, even on the volunteer side, typically that's not budget neutral. It costs some dollars to do this. It costs some dollars to have you sitting in this room. It costs some dollars to have a member of your staff go somewhere to enhance the skills that they're going to bring back to your organization to make it stronger. So the board has to be involved in this right from the beginning. As far as the staff goes, it's really important to know who's in charge. It's also important to know who's in charge if that individual is absent. So we've got a bunch of executive directors here today. And there may be clinics that are going on even as they're sitting. Who's in charge there? Who makes a call? There's a call to be made other than frantically calling who's ever sitting in this room. That's important to know. It's important to know throughout the organization so that should they be called upon to make a decision, it's not one that everyone else in the organization wonders about. They know that if Marty's not there, then Susie's going to make the call. And that's the way it's going to be. It's also important to develop these leadership skills in the room. And you do that through your performance evaluations. You do that through giving people different learning opportunities. And you support the staff in terms of that growth and development. And I mention that because it's not always easy to do. And here's a really good example. I ran a large tree clinic for a long time. I had a great administrative assistant. She was top drawer. But she was overqualified for what it was she was doing for me. And we reached a place where I realized, I'm not entirely sure that she did, but I realized that she had more potential than I was taking advantage of. And so I took it upon myself, as I did and encouraged other supervisors within the organization, to work with that person to understand where they wanted to go next, what they wanted to do. And built in those kind of learning plans into their performance and their performance evaluation. What do they aspire to, and what are we doing within our organization to get you from where you are to where you'd like to move forward? Oftentimes, the leaders of tomorrow within our organizations are within our organization. And it's up to us to identify them, to help nurture them and move them along and prepare them for the time when they can take those greater responsibilities. I'm not going to take time talking about board succession. It should be in your bylaws. The only thing I do want to say about this is that board leadership succession planning begins with the nominating process. That anyone you bring on your board, part of your consideration should be, what is the potential of this individual to ultimately assume some leadership within our organization? You don't necessarily go out and find people who will be your next board chair each and every time you recruit a new board member. But you do want to recruit people that will take on not just the responsibilities that you give them when they join, but will be willing to be committed to the organization, committed to the mission, and be willing to spread their wings a bit, if you will, in terms of leadership roles, your committee chairs, other board offices, etc., as time goes on. Because if your board bylaws are crafted properly, you're going to have a finite amount of time with these people. Oftentimes, it could be 6 years or 9 years, 2 or 3 terms, whatever you've got. And you want to make sure you take full advantage of each individual during the time that you have and maximize their potential. I want to mention founder transition. How many people in the room helped start their clinic? Still got at least 1, 2, got a couple left. When you guys leave, it's a problem. And it's a problem that's easily addressed, but it's necessary to recognize that when a founder moves on, it's different than when somebody that's joined the organization moves on. Those of you that have been with an organization for a long time, you may be recognized as the face of the organization. And when that face changes, if the organization is going to smoothly run, then the community needs to be brought into the picture and recognize that a change is happening, and it's a positive change. It's going to be a strengthening change. It's going to be welcomed by the organization, and we're going to be able to better serve the community as a result of this. I point out this first statistic, which actually the people standing in the room indicate that there are some exceptions to this rule. But when I started in my career, which was longer ago than probably anybody here, it was a time in which you sought to find a position, you sought to find an organization, and that became your work home. And it was not at all unusual. My father retired from the place that he got his first job. I'm sure many of your parents had the same experience. Our kids live in a different world today. They're going to have 10, 15 different jobs or even careers before their work time is over. Recently, a survey said in the next 5 years, nearly 3/4 of the executive directors in the nonprofit world are going to be changing positions. So that tells us that planning for these changes, rather than just allowing them to occur, makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to go through some of this. You'll pick this up as we go along. Now, I did mention that many of these successions can come from within. And one of the jobs that those of us that are in leadership positions within your organization have is to mentor new leadership. And so I would encourage all of you to have not just a job description and an annual evaluation, but some learning goals and some learning and some growth opportunities that are built into that you in fact include in that annual evaluation at the end of the year. Did you indeed have the experience of going outside the organization and taking a 2-day training on whatever it is? And if you haven't, what can we do to make sure that it does occur? I've got a little note on here that says promoting from within should be a priority, and I believe that. For those of you that have small staffs, look at your volunteer corps. You know, people volunteer for organizations that they have a strong belief in. They're giving you their time. And oftentimes I was very successful in finding people from that large pool of people who were willing to say, when an opportunity arose that they could join an organization and become an employee of that organization, even though it might mean some sacrifice financially, their heart led them to make the decision that made them part of the clinic. So looking within is a really good place to start. I made mention of the medical director. And I do, when I talk about succession planning with groups other than clinics, obviously this is it's not one that I talk about. But for all of us, a medical director, whether it's a staff position or a volunteer position, is essential to the operation of your organization. And I know for me, when I hired a medical director, or appointed one, before we paid one, I would breathe a huge sigh of relief and say, thank goodness, I've got someone in that position that's going to be capable, that I trust, and I don't have to think about that again for a while. Mistake. I should have been thinking about it immediately after I put that person in place. I should have been thinking about who in the volunteer corps may be in a position to move up a ladder should they be called upon to do so. Does it make sense in your organization to have not just a medical director, but an assistant medical director? Does it make sense in your organization to think about the person that you have in the slot at present who's an MD, who may be the end of the line of the MDs that you can find for a position like that, and you need to look for somebody who's a midwife. There are clinics all across the country that have nurse practitioners or physician assistants as medical directors. There are limits to that, there are challenges to that, but there are many clinics that operate successfully with those in place. What we're talking about is developing a plan, and my encouragement is that be a written plan, and that the details of the positions that you're looking to planfully provide succession to are included in those written descriptions of how that's going to happen. Down to the nth degree. You know, where's the key to the file cabinet? Why do I use that as an example? When I became the executive director, I was one of those people that my predecessor went on vacation, didn't come back. Now, there was a lot of mess that I found, but I didn't find it until I could get the file cabinet open. And nobody knew where the key was. So, when I talk about the nth degree, I'm really talking about getting down to the detail. And for those of you who are in those leadership roles, all of those little things that you do every day, imagine somebody trying to replicate that who had absolutely no idea how you went about doing it. It's a challenge, but it's one that's addressable if you think through it appropriately. I have about 5 minutes left. I have a special guest who has done this. And normally I give her like 5 or 10 minutes to talk, so she gets to talk.
I can imagine, yeah, about a minute and a half.
Susie talking for a minute and a half.
Virginia Ann said she would go after the break, so y'all take a few more minutes, please. Go ahead. This is important.
Okay, so Susie has 2 minutes.
Thank you, Marty. Susie Foley, an executive director at the Greenville Free Medical Clinic, and have been for 17 years. So Cindy, Susan, and I go back to the old days. This is important. In almost 30 years of nonprofit management and several careers, I've seen successful transitions and I've seen not so successful transitions along the way, where it was well thought out and planned and there was an action to be followed, and then some where everybody ran around like the chickens with their heads cut off. We worked with Marty last year and on a capacity building grant, and that included a lot of kind of big picture items about a lot of the changes going on in our community and in healthcare, about branding and marketing issues. You know, kind of as part of that whole discussion though, was as we realize we are going to be needed in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and the organization is planning for the change in the future, then the leadership needs to be planning for the change in the future. So it became much more of a discussion about we really ought to be a little more specific about how that change would occur. And so I was charged as part of my annual planning and organizational goals to develop a written succession plan. Well, it's kind of scary because, you don't, first of all, you don't know where to start. And second of all, who has the time to do that stuff when you're trying to put out the hot fires of what's going on around you and what needs to get done? We looked at a lot of different models, we looked at a lot of different templates, a lot of things. And I tried to, the first thing, remove myself from how would they replace me? You have to look at it a little more objectively. How does this position get replaced in a variety of circumstances and scenarios that might occur? We had to look at a couple of different variations. One, planned or unplanned. Ideally, I announce my retirement, give them plenty of time. There's a process that's in place and it all goes very smoothly and there's a nice transition time and training and overlap and all that stuff. But that may or may not be the case because you just can't plan when it's going to be. So planned versus unplanned, the circumstances and what you do in those cases. Another variable to address is temporary versus long-term, or short-term versus long-term. It could be a leave of absence, it could be an illness that you're away, it could be an extended period of time where some reason that you do plan to return, but you've got to figure out what's going to happen in the meantime, versus something that may be more long-term that other arrangements need to be put in place. And then the variable of permanent versus temporary. Is it something that an acting director needs to step in just for a short term, or is it something that is not going to return? So you do kind of look at these variables and remove yourself. I tried to also, in compiling a good plan for the board to take on moving forward, because it is their decision eventually on who they hire and who they put in place. But to look at it from the position of myself as the director, if I'm the one leaving, how do I want to see that change occur? From a board member, because I've been a board member with other organizations, and what's the expectation of the board? They're smart people, they know how to do this, they do it in their jobs, in banks and businesses and hospitals all the time, but they're volunteers, so they're not going to have quite the same sense of urgency perhaps, or know how the structure of a nonprofit works. And then also from the perspective of who's stepping in after me in this position and what kind of process that would be the most beneficial for them to know, and what has occurred prior to the time that they take on those responsibilities, and makes it an easier transition from that point of view. So there's several different sort of objective points of view to take into consideration. Built into the written plan are a couple of really key components, and when he talks about the key to the file cabinet, stuff like that's important. If I had a nickel for every time I heard my staff say, I don't know, that's a Susie thing. They're really very good at doing all the stuff in the clinic that they do, but there's some things that end up on my desk and on my plate that just by default, nobody else in the clinic may not necessarily know or be aware of. So one thing that was really important in the written plan was to develop a key contact and information inventory. And that was a grueling process and has to be updated really pretty consistently. Passwords, who are the bankers, who are the insurance agents, who are the vendors, a lot of those key information. That institutional knowledge is in the heads of a lot of people who've been around for a long time, but there's no way and no set structure to be able to share that information and pass that along. And again, looking at it from the point of view of who's coming in temporarily or permanently to assume those responsibilities, what do they need to know to be able to make that a smooth and successful transition? It also includes a pretty active communication plan. Because either in a planned or unplanned, short-term, permanent, long-term, whatever the circumstances are, there are some key people that are going to need to be notified. And whose responsibility it is to do that and how that's handled can sometimes make all the difference in the world of how your reputation is moving forward, how the situation, the circumstances, how that's handled with funders, with key partners, with the board members themselves, how it's communicated to the staff and other people, how it's communicated in the community is really a very, very important part of how successful you're going to make that occur. And we have built into our plan a evaluation of where we are and what are those skills and what sort of leader does the organization need at that point. So there is a process to kind of kick back rather than automatically start advertising to hire a replacement. Say, okay, what are we looking for? What skills? Where do we need to target? What kinds of leadership abilities are we going to be needing as we move forward from this point? So there's sort of an assessment process that's taken into consideration. Like I say, the boards are smart people. They would probably figure this all out. They'd probably be able to do that in a very successful manner. But to know that there's a written plan that they all have, that our board adopted in June of this year, that at least is a checklist and a structure for how they would move forward and be able to address that, I think has been very helpful. There's also some input from the staff for, what has been good about the current leader, what would you like to see in the next leader? Although it is key to remember that the board is the one that hires, so there is some input. It's not a decision-making responsibility of the staff to have that decision moving forward. But it has been helpful to have those discussions. I go on vacation every year and take a nice big vacation, and the board says, "You are coming back, aren't you?" And be real careful when you're out there following your husband on all those adventurous things that we do. But it is reassuring to know that there is a plan in place, and it was helpful to kind of bounce ideas and work through that discussion with someone who said, in my ear, whispering in my ear, you need to be thinking about that. You need to be helping the organization move forward because we're not going to be here forever, and it is important for us to do. And I would say I know there are 1,000 things that need to get done in a day and a week, and it's hard to set aside that kind of time to work through that. But it's critical to do it, and then to go back and review it regularly and make sure that it's still on track, so that at the time that it might ever be needed, that you have that structure in place. So, thank you, Marty.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one for Ms. Hill. Get back to what you said about compensating the volunteers. We're a very small organization, and all the money that we've written grants for comes and is stated that it's to be used for that purpose only. Is there any way we can compensate our volunteers for mileage or anything like that in the other means?
Well, the short answer is yes. When you get into the question of do we compensate volunteers or not, whether it's just for mileage or for a meal while they're there or whatever it might be, you want to be certain that you have a very clear policy about it so that it's uniform across the board. But my encouragement to any clinic is that you always, as you look at your revenues, be certain that you have as diverse revenues as you possibly can. And some of that is general revenue that comes to you because somebody has written you a check that just I write you a check for $50 because I want your work to continue. How you use that $50 is up to you. And So if in your determination you decide that there's value in reinforcing your volunteers, if travel is a problem, if gas is an issue, whatever it may be, then in a planful way to do that equally across the board may be something you would consider. You know, what I was speaking earlier about was that point in time when that really good volunteer would look really good as a staff member that you can count on permanent. And that's when support for that would transition from your general operating revenues perhaps to a great position or other such.
So to solve that problem, we would have to write a grant where it's not allocated for any specific business.
Well, or attack general revenue in a bunch of different ways. Grants is typically not the way to go about that, but maybe you and I can have some conversation afterwards about some of the ways that you might do that. Any other questions? Just one last word that I would say. Succession planning is often a fairly new concept for people. As Susie said, it's not a bad idea as you're going through that process internally to have somebody externally to bounce those ideas off, to give you some framework in terms of how to approach it. And should there be an interest on any of your parts in doing that, I've had some experience doing it with Susie and some others. Be happy to talk with you about it. That's with a hat on other than that. Thank you very much.